Hey there. I wanted to do a video and talk about this Swiss Soldier Type 1901 that I recently acquired. I did a short slideshow video on the refurbishment or restoration of it, but I really wanted to talk about it because it's kind of a complicated knife. So what a Type 1901 is just the Type 1890, the very first Swiss soldier knife, the very first Swiss Army knife, but with fiber scales instead of the wood or oak scales. When these originally came out, they were wood. The wood tended to split. That was a problem, so they thought they could fix that by going to these fiber scales in 1901. They turned out to be actually worse because at least the first formulation of this fiber had a bad habit of reacting with the pins, and the two would corrode each other, and the scales were fragile. They would fall apart. So a lot of these were just thrown away or discarded over the years. And because of that, they're actually rarer than the model 1890s. So otherwise, they're just pretty much exactly the same as the 1890. And I never really considered it its own separate type or model. And I don't think Victorinox did either, because in this book that Victorinox put out on the occasion of its 100th anniversary, they've got a page showing the evolution of the Swiss soldier knife and the Swiss officer's knife, and they'd go right from the 1890 to the 1908. But every time I would talk to folks in the know about my collection, they would always say, "Oh, do you have a Type 1901?" To which I'd have to answer no. So I finally decided if everybody else is going to consider it its own type or model, then I should quit swimming upstream against that, and I should too. And then once I accepted that, I had to get one because my collection is really trying to show each of the types or the evolution of the different knives. So I set about trying to get one, and as I said, they are quite rare and hard to find, but I found one in Switzerland. But the seller, of course, only accepted payment in Swiss bank transfer or Swiss post transfer, and they did not ship internationally. So I had to call on the assistance of a dealer there in Switzerland, a man by the name of Robert Moi, who I've dealt with before, and I asked him to purchase this knife for me and then forward it on to me, which he did, and he would not accept a dime for his time or efforts. So many thanks to Robert Moi. By the way, if you ever have the opportunity to deal with Mr. Moi, I highly recommend him. He's a very honorable person. Now, this knife had some issues, and I knew that when I bought it because they were quite apparent. The first was its condition, which I'll talk about in a moment and what I did to try to fix it. But the second one was the fact that the knife carries no tang stamp. And so there's really no way of knowing exactly who produced the knife or where it was made. Now, I've corresponded with another Swiss knife dealer and an expert in the area, a gentleman by the name of Stefan Schober, and he's been very, very helpful in helping me figure out what's going on with this knife. He tells me the fact that it does not have a tang stamp can tell us two things. First of all, that it's probably not Swiss-made, but German-made by a cutler in Solingen, because the Swiss cutlers at the time, L plus C, Elsener Suisse, Cutellerie Suisse, and Stadler Zug, all had pretty clear tang stamps. But the only official German supplier to the Swiss Army for the model 1901 was a company by the name of De Perez, and they had a tang stamp De Perez Solingen. So the fact that this does not have that tang stamp probably means that this was a private market knife, kind of a civilian issue of the 1901. That brings us to another question. Here you see that it does have the original style control mark. This was the control mark used from 1891 up until 1915, at which time it got a circle around it and a WK became known as a Waffen control stamp. But this control stamp was the original control stamp used when the Swiss Armory would inspect a knife and accept it. It was also used when a Swiss arsenal would repair a knife. So maybe one of two things is going on here. Number one, someone could have put this on here in kind of a dishonest manner. It might be kind of a little counterfeit to try to give this old knife a little better pedigree. I don't know who would go to the trouble of doing that to such a poor condition knife without a tang stamp, but you never know. The second possibility is that a soldier acquired this knife privately, and that was not uncommon either because if a soldier lost or damaged their knife outside of service, they were kind of on the hook to go get another one. So a lot of soldiers acquired knives privately. And sometimes they would take those privately acquired knives to a Swiss arsenal for repair. The arsenal would not recognize them, go ahead and repair them and stamp them. So that's a possibility here as well. But so this knife, I've been told by both of those experts, is a Type 1901. So prima facie, it's a 1901. You know, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and walks like a duck, it's a duck. It's just a duck without a very good pedigree. Okay, so let me talk a minute about the condition of this knife as it came to me and what I did to repair it. If you watch that video on the refurbishment, you notice that the scale here in the back was kind of broken off right there through the middle of the pin, was completely gone. There's a lot of rot around this pin on this side. Both of the scales were loose, and the knife was actually kind of spreading apart here, the liners and the springs in the back. Actually, I took this front scale completely off. It just slid right off. Basically, the thing was almost, as I was opening it, closing it to clean, it was really just about falling apart in my hands. So I removed this scale completely, and that gave me the opportunity to clean the liner, clean the back of the scale. There was, 100 and something years of gunk under there. Get a nice clean surface to epoxy it back on. And I did the same here. There was a lot of rot around this pin, which I dug out with an X-Acto until I got to a good solid scale there. And I hoped to be able to slip it off too, but it would come off the pins, but it wouldn't come free of the back rivet here. And I didn't want to break it or have to cut it all the way off. So just in a propped open manner here, I cleaned underneath it, got a good clean surface there, and epoxied those scales back in place. And while that was curing, I puddled a generous amount of that two-part clear epoxy around the pivot, the domed head of the pivots, and the liners. The idea was to keep these liners from just traveling out along the pins. And the curious thing about this knife, maybe this type of knife, but this knife in particular, is that without the scale squeezed between that peened out pin and that liner, there's nothing to keep the liner from just traveling out along the pins. So every time you'd open a tool or something, it would just expand. So that's how I kind of secured that. Once that cured, I built up this scale with a product called JB Weld Quickwood. And it's just a two-part epoxy putty. And it's got no wood in it, but it has the density of wood, and you can sand it and shape it. And it's very strong. So I built that up and formed it, tried to make it look like the rest of the knife. I think I did a pretty good job. But when it cures, it is just a kind of a bland, a blonde look. It's kind of just like a kind of a whitish tan. So I had to make it match the rest of the knife. And so what I did is I just got modeler's paint, and I found that Testors enamel, rust color was the closest match. It needed a little bit of red, a couple of drops of red to get it exact. And so then I painted it. At that point, it just looked kind of brown. So I wanted it to be uniform with the rest of the knife and the staining you see on the rest of the knife. So I got a little bit of flat black and just got a little bit on a brush and brushed most of it off. And then just when I had just a slight amount on a brush, I just kind of dabbed around to kind of antique it, to emulate the way the rest of the knife looked. The idea was it's kind of a faux painting to make the new part look like the old part. And I didn't do that to fool anyone, of course, but I just couldn't. I had to repair the knife to get it structural, and I didn't want to leave, just white putty, and I certainly didn't want to leave just brown paint. So I think that came out pretty good. It looks fairly authentic, and again, the knife is fairly stable. Okay, let me just compare this knife to the 1890 I have there on the table and 1908 as well, so we can kind of see how it differs. First of all, the best thing about this particular specimen is the blade. These blades had spear point. These knives had spear point blades. The 1890 and the 1901 had spear point blades. That's a really easy way to tell them apart because when 1908 rolled around and they went to this model, they switched to a clip point blade. The 1908 was the only Swiss soldier knife to have a clip point blade because when they got to the type 1951, They went back to a spear point blade, and they've had that ever since. But usually what you see is a more wasted blade. This has got a pretty good blade on it. This is more typical for a knife that's, 125 years old or something, has been sharpened on all those years. So this knife's got a pretty good blade. But yeah, those had the spear point blades. Let's look at the screwdriver next. That was an important tool for a Swiss soldier. That was required on these knives so they could work on their rifles. The dimensions between the 1890 and the 1901 are about the same. The biggest difference you can see is the nail nick. Now this is an L plus C, and it has a very pronounced deep nail nick. On this no-name 1901 over here, it's much more slight. And let's look at the awls or reamers next. By the way, you can hear the snap on some of these tools. Keep in mind that these knives are over 100 years old, so that's pretty impressive. The awls are about the same size and shape, not a huge difference there. One subtle thing here is that you'll notice on my 1890 it kind of has a rounded shoulder, where here you see a much more squarish shoulder. And Stefan Schober tells me that that's an indication that this was probably a German manufacturer as well. And then that brings us to the can openers, where it gets even more complicated. So on the left there is an official Swiss soldier can opener. You can see the bevel here on the outside of the knife, and it just looks a little, the dimensions are a little different looking. It looks a little more refined. Over here, I'm not sure what we have because the bevel's on the inside. The dimensions are a little different. This portion is certainly wider. It looks more crudely made, and it's bent. So it perhaps was made out of inferior steel. So this is not an original part. This was obviously something that was put in later to replace the original part. Now, could that be the repair that got it this control stamp? No, because the Swiss Arsenal never would have put a Swiss soldier knife part in the knife. So this was probably something that was done separately by someone privately, private cutler or something. They just got something similar and put it in there. You can tell it's not exact dimensions. There's a little wiggle there. There was damage around the end here, so maybe that was all part of that. So yeah, that's just a look at those. Just also some differences between the 1908. They're the same length. They're all 100 millimeter, but the 1890 and the 1901 are much wider, heavier knives. And all the tools are bigger and thicker and heavier as well. So much more sturdy, I guess, substantial knives. They're also much rounder or cheekier on the scales. You can see them kind of wobble here on the table, whereas the 1908 has got a flatter handle to it. Okay, so there's a look at a very rare Swiss soldier knife, maybe the rarest of all Swiss soldier knives. And while this particular one has some issues, I'm very happy to have it. If you were to find one of these in good condition with a clear tang stamp, it could easily cost you over $1,000. I just paid a fraction of that, and now that the knife is repaired, it's fully functional and a good visual representation of the Type 1901 to have in my collection. So I hope you found that interesting, and thanks for watching.